big pieces come as far away as America and Cuba, because we, the kids, read the labels. And when the trade winds come across, especially in winter, there's a lot of plastic. But it's not just about the big pieces of plastic, it's about the tiny little pieces of plastic, the breakdown of the plastic, microscopic plastic. And I keep telling my kids they should become scientists, not to try and crack gravity or anything like that, is because I think in 100 years' time, the greatest person that ever lived is going to be the person that got the plastic out of the ocean. I was wondering if you could comment about that, if you know anything.
I think Callum has a whole chapter in his book on the subject.
Plastic, that wonderful modern invention. You know, the amazing thing about plastic is it's a problem that's come to bite us in the backside only in the last 10 years or so. And one of the most astonishing facts that I came across when I was researching for my book was that reveals the nature of the exponential curve, and that is the kind of curve which is accelerating upwards. And that is that in the first decade of the 21st century, we produced more plastic than in all of history before that. And you know, and in the next decade of the 21st century, we will probably double it again. It's one of those ever-accelerating functions of our consumer-led society. And the reason that this problem has only come to bite us very recently is because the plastic has just been quietly accumulating out there in the oceans, drifting its way into the middle of these ocean gyres. And very occasionally, those gyres vomit forth quantities of plastic, which is rather ancient in plastic terms. And this happened in the middle of the Pacific. One of the great rotating gyres there spat out some of its contents, which landed on Hawaiian beaches and literally covered them with confetti. And that confetti was the plastics of 40 years of breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments. I think the only way that we can deal with plastics is to stop putting them into the oceans in the first place. That's our best route to ridding the oceans eventually of the more grotesque of the rafts of plastic that have been accumulating. There is a possibility that we could devise some skimmers that could go to the areas that are especially concentrated to it and you know, which gather the plastics together and remove things down to roughly bottle cap size. But there isn't really any realistic prospect of getting down to these smaller and smaller fragments. And you know, we add to our problems continuously. Tumble dryers, washing machines in particular, because you know, we're flushing the water from them. All of those synthetic fabrics that we are putting into the washing machine, those fibers go through the filters and into the sea. And so we're getting ever tinier fragments on which chemicals attach, and which are small enough to be ingested by plankton, which are at the base of the food web, which means that what we have put into the sea is coming back to haunt us once again. And so I think you're right. If we can figure out a way to rid the oceans of plastic, that deserves at least a Nobel Prize.
I'm Guy from Lyme Regis. I'm really glad the issue of plastics has suddenly come up. It may be a side issue as far as this meeting is concerned, but it gives me a chance to ask you the question we've been trying to find out, the answer for a question we've been trying to find out. In Lyme Regis, we're trying to become another plastic bag-free town. There's a group there trying to do this. And we are trying to know what to tell the shopkeepers to use rather than plastic bags. And I've realized the problem is a lot of them are using what they call degradable bags. They aren't degradable. What is the difference between degradable and biodegradable? Do these bags that are called degradable actually become earth, or do they end up as little bits of plastic? And is there a kind of plastic bag we can recommend to them to use? Some of them have to use some kind of tough bags that is made of something that will actually compost and that they could realistically use. Do you know the answer to that?
Well, you've answered it yourself, which is that what you have to look for is the compostable bags, because degradable means it will fragment. and it will just fragment faster into small pieces, and to a bag manufacturer that means the problem's gone away, whereas we all know that the problem hasn't gone away. In fact, it's got worse because now those little fragments are small enough to be ingested by things at the base of the food web, and then all the contaminants that attach to them will end up in the flesh of things that we like to eat. So go for compostable plastic bags, not for degradable or biodegradable.
Of course, what really makes a difference is a 5p plastic bag tax. They've done it in Wales, and overnight, 10% of the amount of bags being consumed is now coming to England, and that will make a huge difference. Of course, we should remember that plastic bags are actually a very small component of the total amount of plastic. I did a plastic spotting guide down the River Wye once when kayaking down it, and actually the great majority of plastic there was agricultural. It was, that was the horticultural area, so you'd expect it, but there's just loads of black silage sacks and bits of polytunnel and the strawberry, the sort of transparent strawberry stuff they put over the fields, and actually that is probably in aggregate a far bigger set of impacts than plastic bags.
And actually, when it comes to Wales, they're one of the most, partly because where they sit in the food chain, a lot of that plastic will eventually end up in Wales because of what they're eating partly. And plastic bags, there was a case of a young sperm whale found off the coast of Spain, which had ingested 100 plastic bags. There's huge amounts of obviously plastic here, which they eat because they squid, usually, I would imagine. But the other aspect, I think, of the other contaminants going into the marine environment is the PCBs and heavy metals. And again, with sperm whales, again, because of where they sit in the food chain, like sperm whales, a lot of the tooth whales, beluga whales, which now when they die, the beluga whales in the St. Lawrence Seaway in Canada are so toxic they have to be destroyed as toxic waste. And sperm whales, the other, just the subtlety of it, I think the sperm whale, partly because of it is the whale of Moby Dick, it's so much being subject to everything we've done, really. Sperm whales now, because they breathe so deeply at the surface, they spend 90% of the time diving, so that only 10% of the time is at the surface. And they dive so deeply, they're really charging their blood with oxygen at the surface, and Callum confirms that now many sperm whales are ingesting things like chromium from the air, which in humans is sort of, you almost get lung cancer within months. Actually, it's not causing cancer. In sperm whales, it's a very interesting notion, although it is causing birth defects analogous to Down syndrome. But the great irony is that there's I spoke to a scientist who used to work on this in the University of Maine in Portland, in New England. Actually, he's getting funding to examine why sperm whales can survive and not get cancer from chromium, and what application has that got for human beings? It's the ultimate, the usual appropriation of the natural world. So, exactly.
Any other?
Yes, Ben Herbert, West Dorset Greenpeace. I was very surprised you say it's only 2 to 3 years for fish stocks to recover, because the cod stocks off of Newfoundland are never recovered.
And the cod stocks off Newfoundland is a particular case, and of course, you're quite right to sort of pull me up in that you can't generalise about every species with a single statement. But the cod is very interesting in that it now seems that cod, like salmon, are in separate populations, and that they will follow particular migration routes to their spawning grounds and have particular spawning grounds, and that if one population gets wiped out, another population won't come and fill that gap any more than the salmon from the River Tweed will start running up the River Thames. And the cod, it seems, and Callum, correct me if I got this wrong, are following kind of undersea rivers, effectively, to find their routes. And once the bigger and older cod, who are the ones which get fished out first, are eliminated, they're the ones who lead the other cod to the spawning grounds. You can see how you get a sort of positive feedback taking place and an accelerating collapse of the population. Also, as cod numbers are depleted, the number of their prey begins to rise, and when their prey, as so often is the case, a species such as mackerel and herring, the mackerel and herring then eat the juvenile cod, and the relationship is effectively reversed, where the mackerel and the herring become the predators and the cod become the prey, and they prevent the cod numbers from rising again. Jellyfish will have a similar impact when their numbers get too high. These are examples of a trophic cascade, of impacts in the food chain, the trophic web, the web of feeding relationships. At the top of the food chain, if you seriously disrupt it, then it will cascade all the way down, and you will get what biologists will call a cascading regime shift, and you'll end up with sometimes a completely different ecosystem, which is what appears to have happened on the Grand Banks. Callum would understand all that wrong.
No, not at all. That was all right as far as it went. But there is a more prosaic reason why the cod haven't come back on the Grand Banks, and that is because the Grand Banks are now prawn central, and so we have just simply downsized the nets so that we can catch prawns. And of course, any cod that gets in the way of a prawn net is going to be toast. So we end up sieving the sea in these places that were former strongholds for cod, and you never get to be a big cod any longer. We're doing the same thing right on our own coasts. The Irish Sea is now subject to fishing by two of the most damaging fishing methods devised, prawn trawling and scallop dredging, and between them, the prawns trawlers are sieving the sea and the scallop dredgers are flattening the habitat and digging up the bottom. So while those two fisheries are intensifying, there is no prospect of getting the cod back in the Irish Sea. It simply isn't going to come back. If we want to get the cod back, we have to put some real protection in place and restrict the footprint of those fishing gears, and that's the same thing in Canada.
Next question.
Hello, my name is Simon Krebs. I don't think I've heard so much common sense on one platform in many years, so thank you very much for the last hour or so. Can I pick up on what sounded like a contradiction, but I probably got it wrong, is that the government set up a few years ago a process called finding sanctuary, and they said to everybody, come together, figure out where you want your protected areas, you work it out everybody, fishermen, other users, conservationists, tell us where you want them. And then that happened, and it worked out rather well. We ended up with 127 agreed sites, and the government said, well, no, there's other criteria you haven't considered because they haven't told us at the start. And so you have a government that is terrified of setting up these protected areas because they're terrified that the fishing industry, in this case, is going to argue against them. You talked, Callum, you talked about how you start by disagreeing with the protected areas, but then when they come into use, people come round. Yet you said ham-fisted for Nine Bay, which was the absolute case where it was a disaster. The government had to step in before there was a complete ecological disaster. They stepped in, and now we're trying to clear up, and doing in particular, trying to clear up afterwards. Is there a case of just making these protected areas and trying to sort them out later, or do we have to go through consultation on everything before we can get anything done?
If I knew the answer to that, I would either feel desperate or delighted. Whichever way it falls. I don't know is the answer. I think we need to have more demonstration sites, and in establishing these demonstration projects, somebody is going to be upset. We're never going to get complete consensus on doing things. The marine sanctuary process, the conservation zone process didn't reach consensus. I mean, if there's anything about consensus, it means everybody's a bit unhappy. And so the plans that were proposed to government were not universally delighting all the people who have put them together. And I think that the most disgruntled have done their political end runs and derailed the process now. We've got to get some protected areas in place. We've got to protect them well. We've got to monitor them well. We've got to demonstrate that this is a viable management tool, and just get on with it. There are places in the UK, for example, Scotland, where in Arran, the community of Arran Seabed Trust, a completely local organisation, grassroots, demanded over a long period of time a protected area for their own waters. The Scottish government were initially dismissive, and then they were patronising, and then eventually they thought, hold on a minute, there's votes in this, and these people won't go away, and they're getting more and more publicity, and oh my God, we're looking bad now. So they gave them eventually a pocket handkerchief-sized marine conservation zone, no-take zone as it's called. And students from the University of York are studying the hell out of it, and we will be presenting some of the results showing build-up in populations of lobsters and spillover of lobsters into surrounding fishing grounds at the meeting tomorrow in Weymouth. So, you've got to use what opportunities exist in order to demonstrate that there is value in doing the right thing, essentially.
Can I just add that reserve, Lamlash Bay, is one of only three in UK, in three in UK waters. There's that, there's Lundy Island, and there's Flamborough Head. And between them, they account for 5 square kilometres of our 48,000 square kilometres of territorial waters. That's 0.01% of our waters are no-take zones. Does anyone in this audience feel that that's an adequate response? Yeah, I mean, we have 500,000 signatures calling for 30%, coordinated by the Marine Conservation Society, which was the same figure put forward by the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. In 2002, there was a global agreement that we'd see, 10% by 2012? By 2012?
2012 originally.
2012, 10%, and we managed 2% marine conservation areas, but hardly any of those, this is worldwide, hardly any of those were actually no-take zones. So it's just pathetic. It's been incredibly slow, and it is an indication of the inordinate power of vested interests, even when those vested interests represent what is really a very small industry. I mean, I sometimes wonder, what is this hold that fishermen have over politicians? Do they sink the bodies of their opponents? Do they supply their cocaine? It's almost mystical. I mean, there was a period when basically the entire European fishing lobby effort was being coordinated out of Vigo in Galicia in Spain by a bunch, and I'm not exaggerating here, by a bunch of old fascists. They were Franco's comrades. They were a group of people. Franco built his political base on the back of the whaling and fishing industry in Galicia, particularly in Vigo. And we had this bunch of superannuated fascists dictating policy across the whole European Union. How did that happen?
Herbie? Oh, who's got the man? Sorry.
Hello. You're speaking to an informed and quite motivated group here, who, like me, are going to act.
Speak up, please.
Sorry. Yeah. You're speaking to an informed and motivated group here who are going to act into the world now. What is the smartest thing that an individual, I don't come from this area, so I'm not engaged in this particular issue, the smartest, cleverest thing these days that an individual can do to counteract these vested interests you talk about, just at the individual level? What can we go out of here now and do in the camp? That's the obvious thing. That I take as a given.
It's not so
really.
obvious.
Well, I take that as more or less.
But that is the right answer. I mean, don't do anything by yourself. That's the key thing. If you try to act alone, you're not going to get anywhere. You know, we have this myth of individualism in this country where we just watch too many movies where sort of this lone hero goes off and sorts out the entire problem. No, I'm not suggesting you did, but you know, the only way in which we can exert any power or influence at all is by getting together with other people. And there are some great organisations, you know, and there are one or two represented in the audience this evening. You know, start with the Marine Conservation Society, you know, your local wildlife trusts as well. You know, there's a lot of people, and probably quite a few others in this audience. There are a lot of people to join up with, and they need you. You know, they badly need you, and it's very rare that you have to create a new organisation. You know, we've got this terrible habit in this country of constantly reinventing the wheel. You know, someone says, "Oh, I know. Why don't we save the marine environment? I'm going to set up an organisation." You know, before looking to see what other people are doing. You know, no one's representing my views in Parliament. I'll start a new party, and it's just, you know, we keep fragmenting our efforts, and where we should be consolidating them. And this particular issue, it's not as if we're lacking really good groups. So please join those groups and make them even more effective. Could I just add one of my bugbears, and that is that the democratic process is undemocratic when it comes to citizen support for policies that go against, for example, vested interest. So the 500,000 people who signed up to the Marine Conservation Society's argument about 30% marine protected areas around the country, they count as one to the government advisors who weigh up the consultations to their process of seeking public comment. So if you sign your little postcard or whatever that says you want such and such a policy enacted, then make sure it's individual. Make sure it's written individually, even if there's a pre-done form, because otherwise you'll simply be lumped as one submission from one organisation. And it's ridiculous the way that they do it, and I think it's undemocratic. And I wish that we were more able to accept that majority of opinion, which is, if you haven't got a livelihood directly vested in the sea, does that mean that your voice matters less? I don't think it does, and I think that that's where we need to redress the balance in terms of public consultations, because it's clearly skewed too horribly towards the vested interests at the moment.
So if I've understood you correctly, I should do something as an individual then?
Yeah, so
Yes.
there is power in individual responses. That's true.
Okay, yes.
Hello, my name is Hannah. I was just wondering, you talk a lot about the marine protection zones and you can't fish in them, and you talk about the fishing boats a lot, but what of the fuel that these boats use, and to what extent do the marine protection sections, to what extent could they be still affected by the fishing that's going on around them, so all the fuel and stuff? And also, to what extent do the bigger animals, you talked a lot about the whales earlier, to what extent are they, they're big players in the kind of sea, and to what extent are they affected by the fuels that weren't there thousands of years ago?
It's a really good question. We were talking about this afternoon actually, because talking about marine protection zones, but what percentage of the ocean are they covering? And you think about the extraordinary aspects of human pollution, anthropogenic noise on whales, animals generally. How do you deal with that? That's a really big problem, and I think I wrote a piece for The Guardian last week about geoengineering in response to Martin Rees's comments about the fact that we are in such an extreme state now. We have to talk about hacking the planet. We have to talk about how we can positively pull back or either reabsorb carbon dioxide or stop the planet from overheating. And the problems that raises are globally hugely problematic, aren't they? Because, you know, who has jurisdiction over the ocean? And we were talking earlier about who has jurisdiction over outer space, and actually Horatio made a joke about the US Air Force or whatever, but actually that often is the case because, you know, the major developing nations who have, you know, the wherewithal to put that stuff up there, are the people who are going to patrol it, you know. So that's a big problem. I don't know what you think about sort of geoengineering generally as an aspect. I mean, the idea for one of the geoengineering projects is iron fertilization, putting iron into the water to create plankton blooms, as I understand it, which then absorb carbon dioxide. In fact, whales were doing this years ago because they were, as George mentions in his book, you know, their feces were creating the same effect. You know, I think we should just encourage sperm whales, really, basically, as well. What do you think?
Well, there's a graph which I think is the most alarming graph that I have seen in relation to global climate change, and that is sea level rise. And what it does is it takes the graph from the 1990 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment of where things are going. It looks at the sea level rise projections, and there's the mid projection where they think, you know, the modelling is getting it just about right, and then there's the best case scenario, and then there's a worst case scenario. And since 1990, we've of course been measuring the sea level using exquisitely precise satellites, which measure within less than a millimetre how high the sea is. And what that shows is that sea level rise is tracking the worst case scenario. So we're not just doing badly, we're not doing anything at all, we're doing terribly. And so there are parts of the world that have experienced 20 centimetres of sea level rise in the last 20 years, which is astonishing by any metric. Not everywhere has. There are some places which have had falling sea levels over the last 20 years. So the reason why Tuvalu is very alarmed about sea level rise is because it sits in the epicenter of some of the highest rates of sea level rise on the planet. So given the utter incapacity of nations to agree to the kind of cuts in greenhouse gas emissions that we need in order to maintain the stability of our planetary environment, I think geoengineering does have to be seriously considered. But not the let's reflect the heat into outer space. That's not going to deal with one of the major problems, which is carbon dioxide dissolving in the oceans and making them more acidic, and that will cause impacts on the plankton productivity, which will reverberate throughout the entire ocean ecosystem. We've got to fix the carbon dioxide problem itself, and that means finding a way to suck it back and put it back in those oil wells that we extracted it from in the first place, and that's going to be a big challenge.
Richard Branson has set up a £25 million prize for someone who can do that commercially. I would be surprised if anyone can. I mean, the physics are against you. You know, you're trying to remove carbon dioxide, which is at small concentrations in the air. It takes a lot of energy to do it. The Royal Society published a report, I think, in 2009, looking at all the possible geoengineering options, and basically the summary of the report was that the generally safe safe and effective ones are extremely expensive, and the cheap ones are all extremely dangerous. And it's like sort of firing sulfur into the atmosphere and stuff like that. So I can totally understand why Lord Rees, sort of in a fit of despair, said, as many people have said, you know, maybe we're going to need geoengineering. but it's actually not going to solve it. I mean, it's not, we assume that that's the easy option, that all the other ones are difficult, that's the easy option. Actually, it's probably one of the harder options, especially if we're talking about the air capture of CO2. The only